Chris. While we're waiting for people to join, I have a simple question. Do you hear me?
Let's see. How's that? Okay, you should be able to hear me now, I hope.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Well,
Hey,
good.
my morning, how are you?
I'm awake, so that's a plus. How are you?
Still in Pacific time or traveling
Yeah.
the globe?
I was in Hawaii last week and then just got back.
Nicely
So,
done. I hope it was a good vacation.
oh yeah, really good.
Hey, question for you. So somewhere I downloaded the series for this meeting, and per that series, this meeting is supposed to take place next week. But I saw your post in the Slack channel yesterday, and then I just got onto this meeting, and it seems like just you and me are here. So where do I get this official series?
It should be correct. The
So I thought,
CNCF calendar. And so on the calendar it was saying this week.
I'm sorry, I'm just probably I'm mistaken as well. Um,
No, it could be. I get confused too. So I'm looking at
'Cause I felt there was a meeting last week, and someone presented Inspector Gadget.
yes, that is the regular tag meeting.
I see.
And then the work group meeting, yes, is today, the
Okay.
13th. Yeah.
Um,
So we'll see
yeah,
if anybody else shows up. But,
no worries.
I think we could still go ahead and talk through a few things, get your input on it at least. That'd be great. Oh, no, not that tab.
Yeah, I also had a chance to, talk with my management about some of the things we discussed, and yeah, I can follow up with you. It'll take me a bit more time to follow up with you.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And this is all public too, so no worries there. Cool. Yeah, so I wanted to. So last week we talked about the case insensitivity of keys. So I've added that in there.
Mhm.
A topic in the context doc, and then I'll keep farming for dissent or discussion there. The other one, the big topic here is around values and what kind of values we should support across the ecosystem here. So the um, OTel spec essentially says that the value is going to be a union, where the value can be one of a primitive type, like a string, double assigned integer, etc., or it can be an array of values. I think that was primarily for some of the vendors who support multi-value um, values, or for the common use case where you have something like A/B test buckets or experimentation buckets, and a request falls into multiple buckets, and you want to know which ones they belong to. So I think the OTel model makes sense. It's very easy to do, particularly for a serialization format. You can pick the union and all of that. The trick, though, is modeling it on the query side.
Yeah,
In that a lot of systems, metric systems, only have strings, anyways. You know, and very few metric systems, in particular, support arrays.
right, right.
Logs and trace systems are a little more flexible, I think, even though
Absolutely.
for the most part, attributes are just strings, anyways.
Yeah.
Um, so the question is how we should model this in a query language. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Okay. Um, yeah, okay. The only language I'm familiar with mostly is Gusto, and it kind of but going by the type system in that language, right? So basically, the way to approach this problem would be is pick one or two languages, look at the type system, and then try and understand type widening, type coercion rules,
Mhm.
and see what they do. For instance, in Gusto, there is there is no int32. Everything is a long, which is an int64. So everything
Mhm.
gets widened as a int64. They're able to um, very likely what's going on is they have good encoding algorithms for that type, so therefore they're able to efficiently represent with probably lesser than 64 bits, and therefore um, they would represent everything as that. Um, what else? They do have a very interesting type called dynamic, which will abstract um, complex types like arrays. It will also abstract JSON. So you could potentially have a JSON string in there. The difference between string and a string that has JSON content is that that column that has a JSON content can be typed as a dynamic, and you could do parse JSON on it, and then you would have a complex structure in there. And that's the same type that they use to represent arrays, for instance, or any other complex repeating types. Um, so with that lens, I would try to simplify the type system that we support and say, okay, JSON types and array types can be modeled as a dynamic, and maybe that's not the official name, but you get the
Mhm,
idea uh, of a type whose actual type is only known at runtime.
mhm, mhm. Yeah, yeah.
I would also try and simplify the integral numbers into mostly maybe as a long, but also as a double to represent the precision, of course. Uh,
Mhm.
Binary strings, Krista doesn't have support, but I think it's useful to have here. Strings, of course, are well
Yeah,
supported.
yeah. Sure. Now, the dynamic type, though, is that actually under the hood strictly typed? Like if you tried to select an index in an array, but the actual value was, let's say, a JSON or something, would it throw an error?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
So it assumes the knowledge of so it assumes so it basically leaves the checking until runtime. Type checking still happens. It happens at runtime, and the user is supposed to be aware of what's coming in there and parse it up appropriately.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Because the big thing here, which again leads into coercion, a few people, like you said, a lot of systems, or I mentioned, will only have string values, but
Mm.
people will treat them as numbers. So we need some way to coerce them
Yeah.
or
Yeah. Yeah.
explicitly cast them.
Exactly.
Um, and then same thing with JSON. If somebody dumps JSON string into a string, you want to be able to parse it out and then use JSON path, etc. Even if they're arrays that P flatten, most common ways you just comma separate values or something, right? Um, so the big question tied in with that is whether or not we want to support coercion or if we want to require explicit casting for all of these,
I see.
regardless of the underlying type.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay. Just putting on the hat of a language designer here. I think coercion makes the language uh, user-friendly, right? Keeps it succinct, like the user. There are places where we can infer what's the right thing to do.
Hmm.
And in those places, absolutely. For example, let's say you have an integral number and you try and compare it with a string. Sure, you can expand it to a string, and then you can still apply string comparison operators over there. Or if we suspect that both sides are going to be integers anyway, we can still do integral comparison, but coerce them as strings and then still do integral comparisons, for example. I
Hmm.
think it makes the language user-friendly, but at the same time, such coercion rules must be explicitly stated, right? Like you could, for example, imagine a simple representation where let's say you have five types, you list them all as five different rows, and then you also have them on the columns. And now you have a table. Like you can cross-check them, integer and an integer. The result is always an integral number. String and an integer. What would be the coerced value, right?
Hmm.
So such rules can be well defined, and I think having those actually helps the user write less code.
Hmm. Yeah, and I'm personally in favor of it. I think particularly in the log space where
Yeah.
people are used to and probably same thing in Data Explorer and whatnot, where if you pull a value, extract a string value out of a log message, for example, and you've applied regex to match on it, and you make sure it's going to be a number as a string, but then you want to sum all of those. You don't want to have to add the explicit cast necessarily.
Yeah.
Although there is, of course, yeah, like you said, too, the coercion rules, even if they're well defined, if they don't adhere to what users expect, then they can get inappropriate data or inappropriate results. So there are some things like, what do you do if the integer actually is malformed and it can't be cast to an integer? Do you just treat it as a null, or do you throw an error? So sometimes having an explicit operator that would throw an error if the value is incorrect allows people to tune their regexes or their capture groups and
Yeah.
whatever.
One feedback into that is it's usually in query languages, right? It's usually a best effort basis. It tries to course, and if that fails, it fails silently. Like it's not going to break the program at that point. It's going to let it proceed. So, for example, it would turn it into a null value or whatever is the default for an integer. Comparison fails, and the code moves on. Instead of stopping the program by throwing an error. I think that makes so whatever we pick, right? Like either you stop the program or you continue with the best effort basis.
Mhm.
That semantic has to be applied uniformly in the language
Correct.
in all places. Kusto, I know, follows that policy of not throwing an exception. In this case, it will try to, if it can't parse out an integer from the string, it'll just give it a default value, and therefore the comparison would fail. And you wouldn't get the expected result, and the user would have to debug that code.
Hmm.
So whichever philosophy we are adhering to, just make it consistent throughout the language.
Yep, absolutely. And I'm kind of leaning towards that, course and follow normal pattern for logging systems or other observability systems where you continue to run. But it's been a problem consistently in the space. And I think one way to help users would be to, I added into this doc, I think something about let's see, cross function query limits, tension, that somewhere about a messaging system in there. So like logs for every query that I've been using more and more in various projects where, let's say the at query time it came across something it couldn't cast, you would capture that in a log message saying this is what we couldn't catch, and then
Mhm.
you sample just the first one, maybe, or maybe a couple of different ones, and then you return that along with the query. And then
Okay.
people have a nice little log message you can look at in the header or whatever, some other output,
So
and that
that would
assists in
be
debugging, I think.
right. So that would be the responsibility of the service
Right.
hosting the language. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Although I'd kind of like to bake it into the spec too, as just a recommendation that, yeah, people wouldn't have to follow it because a lot of systems wouldn't have it initially, anyways. But it would be a nice target to get to.
Right.
Um,
Um, yeah, yeah, sure. I understand that predominantly this language will be used and hosted by a service, so there will be
yeah.
logs somewhere. But the other way to think about it was even if it is not hosted in a service, if someone's trying to run it as a library on a single machine, there would still be um, some error messages, right? Of course, syntactically, it's very easy. Your program is never executed. Semantically speaking, we do all the coercion rules and casting and widening rules, and um, beyond the best effort, something still goes wrong. We still have an exception message or an error or a
Oh yeah.
semantic error or a runtime error message that shows that the program did not succeed, and here's the reason why. And the same thing would then be, so if that was an API contract and if that was a result, so either you get the correct result or it always ends with a failure, a syntax or a semantic failure, then that would be in fact captured and logged by the service hosting the language library.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah. But I want to try to make sure that there's a way to provide that feedback to end users as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Um,
The way I've seen is usually there's a entry point to the compiler, and after the compilation phase, first thing to check is like, has there been any diagnostics? If there's more than one errors or more than zero errors, then obviously you don't get a compiled output back. You only get those errors back.
right. Hmm.
Same for execution. The output of the execution is either a set of values that you expect, or there is some semantic error messages or runtime messages that we couldn't get to earlier.
Hmm. Yeah, in this case, I'm really focused on that, um, a side channel, so to speak, after that execution phase, where even if you get the results you expect, you have a side message, set of messages
Okay.
that
Okay.
return kind of diagnostic messages.
Okay. So in that, well, are you trying to expose the all the internals like the coercion, widening, or what rules were applied, or what's the intent for that?
Primarily debugging. So another thing that we haven't seen as much in the database industry is debuggability. It's something that
Mhm.
is starting to come up now where you have various operations and you want to look at samples of some of the data flowing through each operation, right?
I see.
Um, so you see that more with data frames, which are great, where you can take a snapshot and look at that. I think the Prometheus 3.0 has that capability now, which is pretty cool. In the UI, you can look at some samples of things before, so you can determine, oh yeah, this is a monotonic counter, and rate is being applied. I can see my deltas changing into deltas, or the monotonic string deltas, which is pretty neat. So that's something I like. I don't know if it should be incurred in the spec, but it should be
Mhm.
encouraged for all of our systems.
I think having a node in the spec does make sense. It does
Yeah,
help.
just fine. Hi, Sinu. Thanks for joining. Yeah, so that's cool. So then coming back to this, if we had a column, or if we treated the value then in an attribute as a kind of dynamic type,
Mhm.
just from an output or a query
Mhm.
standard, do you think that would work or be okay?
Can you be a little more specific? So, there is explicit types applied unless in some cases, like for example, if there are simple types, if there are primitive types,
Hmm.
obviously we know what type they are, right? And if they are complex types, then that's when we would go and type them as a dynamic. If that's what you meant, then yes, I would think that'll all work out.
Well, I was thinking of more that the whole value would be dynamic. So if you thought of this as a map in
Okay.
Java, you would have
Okay.
string and then dynamic, something like that. Nope.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
Or if you were back in C++, this would be a union of
Right.
one
Right.
of these types, right?
Okay. Yeah. I don't know about union types in query languages, but I definitely see the C++ reference.
Hmm.
Um,
I think the union type, essentially, it's going to be like a dynamic type. Because,
Dynamic, right? Could you expand a little bit more on when you said it's a map? Um, what I'm trying to get at is, are we okay? So this is within attributes, right? Sure. Okay.
mhm.
Yeah. Now I get it. Now just scroll first.
Sorry,
Okay.
yeah, the keys
Uh,
and values. Yeah.
sure. So okay, I think yeah. Slightly the problem with that approach, right, that I just spoke about is now every value, regardless of whether it was a primitive type or not, has to be a dynamic, and all the type checks are now pushed to the runtime.
Hmm.
Um, but there isn't, I'm trying to see if there is an elegant way to solve this problem because um, even if one of those values is a complex type, then you have to say a dynamic. But if none of them are a complex type, then can you do anything better? That's what I'm trying to see.
Hmm.
I don't, no obvious solution comes to me right now, but I just like to at least call out that if
Hmm.
that's the default type, then for all attribute values, type checking is deferred till runtime. And
Correct.
it might be okay because attributes are loosely defined.
Mhm. And it may be, and we know for a fact that implementations are going to have different behavior or different storage under the hood.
Right. Right.
So there may be a path where, or may be possible, say, for if you're querying Prometheus and you try to apply an array operator, two
Mhm.
paths would be
Mhm.
either Prometheus tries attempts like a default comma parsing of each line, expecting multiple values, and then applies it, or it just throws an error and says, no, this query must be a regex or something because the underlying data type is a string.
Correct. Correct.
That's the kind of stuff that we really have to hammer out as a group
Mm.
in industry. That gets pretty complicated. I'd
Mm.
prefer that we try to parse things, and then if they fail, then it just fails.
Right. No, absolutely.
Uh,
Where that would also, one thing I've noticed is, uh, let's assume that this is hosted in a system, and the system has a backend and the system has a front end, and the user is authoring the query over in the front end. Now, the front end would typically have a language parser. So
Yeah.
any syntax errors are caught right there. Now, if we push the checks to runtime using dynamic, then that takes a remote call, because the query has to be submitted. It goes to the back end where it is evaluated, and then it fails, and then it comes back to the front end saying that's an error. Well, that's okay. But if the user is authoring the query for the first time, we really want to minimize the number of back and forths that we have to do. So anything that we can do at boil time type checking, it's going to be pretty much better user experience by a long margin, I think.
Yep. Yeah, and that's a good point. I think implementation wise, you would have that front end. It would know the type of backend it's calling, ideally. So it would have some schema definitions and handle that translation. So if it knew it was a Prometheus backend, it could perform those checks internally before sending it down. Same thing if it was but for maybe something like a open search cluster, it may not know the types or the schema, so it would have to send the query on, and then wait for the results. Um, but that's definitely valid. Otherwise, yeah, I don't know if there's a better way to try to store attributes. So I'd like everybody on the call around that channel to figure it, to model attributes at least, because we definitely don't want to do. I don't think we want to try to come up with a concept of typed columns and
Yeah.
having the key point to a particular type and column, and that
Correct.
would
I
be
don't
hideous.
know if there is a smart solution that can be arrived at, but the entire idea of attribute just have the flexibility, right, to
Right.
show in things that they couldn't think of ahead of time.
Hmm. Yeah, so I'll leave these here. JSON type. We talked before about at the last meeting how Datadog supports null values essentially because they have label only or key only attributes that aren't used as much, according to I forget the name, Mark, I think. So we do want to allow nulls here and probably have a null check or at least accept them in the language, if that makes sense.
Right. Right. Um yeah, then I think, yeah, what does it mean for uniqueness constraint, for example, like are key values supposed to be unique, or can they be redundant and
Yes, they didn't I add that here? Oh no, yes, these are must be treated as case sensitive. Yes, I need to add that. Thank you for calling it. So we do want to make sure keys are distinct.
okay.
You cannot have multiple keys with the same value. Mhm. Cool. Hey, Sunil. So just to catch you up to, we're covering the types here and discussing whether or not to the modeling around this because the OTel spec allows you to have one of primitive types or a complex type, and we're just trying to figure out the modeling on that and wanted to see if you had any thoughts. And if not, then I don't think we'll cover it all today. But yeah, I had a section here, Balaji. If you have time, I'd appreciate you take a look and see if some of these rules made sense.
Type version. Okay, sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I took them all, like the double type signed integer, which ones we could coerce to, etc.
Okay.
I think the big trickiest one is kind of the string type, right? To coerce to the other values.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That implies parsing. Yeah.
Yeah. Fun stuff. Huh? Timestamps are going to be a little finicky, possibly, because
Yeah.
there's so many standard formats out there.
No,
But
absolutely.
we're
Absolutely.
dealing with time series, so we have to do that, right? And duration and whatnot.
Yep. Okay. Yeah.
And then the map type we need to support. Yeah.
Yeah. Map type is also.
The other issue with the values here and the keys in particular is that we're in SQL or trying to base it off of SQL. So SQL itself, everything is typed, but you can actually do essentially a union type in raw SQL.
I see.
Um, there are ways to do it. DuckDB makes it explicit, but even ANSI SQL, you can finagle your way around it. It's not pretty, but it works okay, I think. So that's just something else to be aware of. Cool. So if that's all for that, we can start kind of discussing metrics, I think. um, so I wish Sergey was here too, but the model here that I've started with for metrics, and we'll probably get into it in the next meeting too, is that you have a start and an end timestamp. They're different and explicit because a lot of the time, most of the time, we are measuring over an interval in metrics. Very few metric systems, I think, actually deal with this, though. They'll only have timestamp, and that's reflective of the time of the scrape or the time of the emission, right? And then so it's exclusive and inclusive start, actually. Um, the reason I call it out explicitly here is two things: is that in the well, it's way down there, but in the logs model, we have the same kind of thing, particularly wide events models, where you have an event that will have a start time and an end time. And same thing with distributed traces. You have a timestamp and then a duration. And it's usually, I think it might be more useful to model it with a start and end timestamp instead of duration. You can still query and say end minus start to get your duration, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. The idea
Mhm.
is, I think it makes sense. As long as we have two, we can always compute the other. We could also to make it easier, we could have standard keywords in the language, right? And maybe duration is a keyword, and or how do I say it? No, actually not a keyword. It's what I'm thinking of is we can inject virtual columns if start and end timestamps or what is available. Then either the user can compute easy enough. If not, we can um, insert auto insert columns that has some default values blocked off of the,
Okay.
the data set.
Hmm.
Internally, we have a system that does this. We call it virtual fields, basically. Those are the ones inserted by the system.
Oh, cool. So, like, if we go to the spans model here, do you think? I guess one thing is that users really are used to using duration or seeing that in a trace, right?
Correct.
So you're saying that you could essentially you would have a ephemeral or
Exactly. Yeah, it's not present in the actual data, but we can project it at all level.
so something like this, and yeah, then from these three columns, the user could query either one. If the data store only has, let's say, the start time, stamp, and duration, then it would compute
Mhm.
the end time at query time, vice versa. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's kind of what I was thinking too. I just didn't explicitly call it out in the
right.
model.
Yeah. But the fact is we have to know or declare, right, which would be this virtual field or an ephemeral column. Like it's not a choice that users can emit any two of those three. They always have to emit those two, and it's always on the query language to compute the third one. Just
Mm.
make things simpler.
Or does it need to be on the language if we just say in the model that we have these three columns and then leave it up to the implementation to handle?
Um,
Yeah.
I think it needs a little bit more thought in the sense,
Mhm.
how does then the language have knowledge of there must be rules to say, okay, these are the virtual columns that I'm aware of, and each column needs is dependent on one or more physical columns. And as long as those rules are present, then the language can derive what it needs, I think.
Well, I'm thinking though that part of this query spec is that we don't concern ourselves too much with the physical implementation.
Gotcha. I
We
see.
just know that there is some way that the physical implementation can operate on a start timestamp, an end timestamp, and a duration
Okay.
in
Okay.
this case. And then, so the user in their projection, maybe they only care about the duration, or maybe they only care about the start timestamp, that kind of
Exactly.
stuff. And it should
Exactly.
work okay. But I think that would work out right. I think.
I see. I see what you're getting at. Yeah.
Hmm. So maybe I'll add a note to that, ping it to the group too. But yeah, in that case, then I think start, end time, and a duration for each one would be kind of useful. The metrics one, it does kind of, it's a little goofy because no metric system I'm aware of actually exposes a duration.
Yeah. That's what I'm saying.
And there are a lot of instances where you may have a gauge, in which case the start and the end timestamp are going to be the same value. And you may just drop the column entirely.
Yeah.
Um, All right, so I'm glad that's not totally kicked out. It might be useful. Because also another aspect is that we do want between the types to have some commonality, if at all possible. Um, so, and the main commonality we'll have would be the timestamps and attributes,
Mhm.
where you can join the data pretty easily.
Yep.
So, like saying, as long as your metric and your log and your trace or spans are instrumented with the same keys and values, particularly adhering to the OTel semantic standards if possible,
Mhm.
then it makes joining all of this data so much easier and nicer.
Yep.
Cool. Then I did add a type column here, and this one is talking about the type of metric under the hood because unfortunately or fortunately we have a lot of different and a lot of history with metrics. We have our old friend cumulative counters, we have delta counters now, we have gauges, and
Um,
Netflix we have rates actually. I don't
yeah.
know if anybody else does. And then of course histograms, approximate counts, approximate distributions.
Got
Should spell
So
that.
these are emitted by the application as one of these types. I see.
Yes.
I see.
So again, we're back to in the value field here. It's going to be one of these types. So it's going to be the union again.
Mm.
Um, and this is where, so there are a couple of questions here. One of these is whether or not we should have an enumeration for the types, which makes the uh, language locked down and a little more easy to work with, particularly when you're doing this compilation of the query and you want to
Mhm.
make sure that somebody doesn't apply a percentile operator to, let's say, a delta counter or something. On the other hand, though, if we need to add a new type in the future,
Mhm.
you have to then extend the enumeration somehow.
No, it makes sense to me because doing that is still backwards compatible anyway. So you could always add more.
Hmm.
So
So you'd be in favor of having an enum?
I would think so. Yeah, I don't see any particular issues with having to extend being a difficult process.
Cool. Yeah, that's kind of I was leaning towards 2. And then the value, this is the part where it gets a little messier too. So with metrics, we have, the raw values stored potentially, but then we also have a lot of tools or companies will roll up that data
Mhm.
on specific intervals, so like a daily interval, maybe, or an hourly, whatnot, so that you can serve those queries looking at historical data really fast. So in that case, the other fields here I added are really around the temporal grouping aggregation, thing about boundaries we'll get back to, and then exemplars, which are in OTel, and then the steps. So the step or interval here, duration, would be for data that is rolled up or aggregated. And then this model also plays double duty in that it reflects the underlying storage that you can query and then intermediate representations as well. So if you say, I do want to query for a day of data with a step interval of 15 minutes, the output would conform to this model in the same way, and then you could apply more transformations on it. You could do more filtering, maybe filter on the value, etc. So I guess the first question is, does it make sense to try to capture all of these use cases in a single model, or which I think makes more sense from a user standpoint if they're going to query different aspects of it. And for the most part, they probably won't query things like this step or temporal or group by aggregation. Those might be emitted, serialized, or used by um, additional operators to do some validation. Or does it make sense to try to have split this out into a raw value model and a aggregation model, or yeah, in
What do
that
you mean by the second statement that you made on splitting up into raw makes sense, and then
way.
you, of course, do the aggregations later on. But could you expand a little bit more on what you were thinking on that idea?
Yeah, so in the raw case, let's say you had a gauge, and we're taking that for example. The start timestamp, end timestamp would be the same. Your type would be gauge here. Your value would just be a double, probably.
Mm-hmm.
And these fields would be null at that point for the raw data.
Correct.
Um,
Correct.
they're still there. If you query them, they'd just be useless. You'd
Mm-hmm.
have null checks. After you apply an aggregation, let's say the step, apply max over 1 minute windows or something, then your timestamp, start timestamp would be the top of the interval, end timestamp would be the end of the interval. The step size would be populated. You would have a temporal aggregation of max. Group by would be null. Temporal boundaries wouldn't exist. Um, but you could say then that the raw data wouldn't even, if we split the models up, we could get rid of these fields entirely. But then the problem comes that if you say, let's say there are some systems that are automatically aggregating the data anyways, and there is no raw data, no metrics data, in which case a query would start off with this information.
I see. I see. Yeah. Trying to think of. Yeah, I don't know how to answer the question right now. Like, would systems maintain a copy of the raw as well as the processed time series data? I'm not sure. I would think for efficiency purposes, they would, if they had transformed the raw, then they would really want to keep the transformed data, not the raw. I would think. I would hazard a guess, but I'm not really an expert, so I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no worries.
Um, but you're right, this representation should model what the user wants. And I just don't know how much we can actually decouple it from the implementation, but I think doing so would be prudent
Mm-hmm.
because we shouldn't make any guarantees of what the
Right.
system will be doing.
Yeah, and I do kind of like having these even in intermediate results, because if
Mhm.
you at runtime, you can at least check. And let's say somebody does a temporal aggregation on average, and then they apply a second one on average. You could at least provide in our feedback system a warning saying you're averaging averages. You should probably do something different.
Right,
That kind of
right.
thing.
Makes sense.
And I think just having a single model that users have to be aware of simplifies things a little bit. Even if under the hood, raw
Mhm.
query would have no data here, but then roll up
Okay.
data would have a query. Yeah, etc.
Yeah, I think I see the merit in doing it. I think I'd probably acknowledge that that's a better way to do it too.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I'll keep ping this around the group, mailing list and whatnot, because I think this is going to be the first area of contention or discussion. I think because Prometheus folks will probably say, "No, you don't do any of this." Who knows? We'll
Not
have to
sure.
see.
Yeah, I think as long as we can make the model generic enough to work with any backend, I think that's the goal. So,
Yep, that should be good. Cool. Yeah, we're at time for today then. So, any other thoughts?
yeah, not as much. Just need some time to go through these. May is a little bit busy here, but by end of
Yeah,
May, I will probably do some more.
cool. No problem. Yeah, if you and like I said, if you can take a look at the coercion rules there, that would be a
Yeah,
huge
absolutely.
help. I think, please.
Yeah,
A
yeah,
lot of stuff to fill out.
gotcha. I'll check. I'll check on those. Maybe I need a couple of weeks or so.
Sure, no problem. Cool. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Alaji. Thanks, Sunil, and yeah,
Thanks.
I'll catch you all next time.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thank you.